Okay, hopefully you are already comfortable from the last lesson on pulling down from production to staging to local, and you're ready to look at making some changes in the local environment and pushing them back up to staging for testing and then production. Okay, so to follow along with this, you're going to need to have a production site that matches the staging environment that is matched in local development. Now, rather than go and make a ton of changes that we haven't really learned yet in this course how to do, let's do something simple here, which is open up the customizer. And again, I am in local development doing this, and I'm going to come down into additional CSS. I'll go ahead and close the notice here so that we have a full area to work. And I'm going to type in here, let me zoom in a little bit, something pretty simple. Hopefully you already know your CSS. I'm just going to say body background white, and that's going to turn the entire background white. Now we could do this through a theme or a child theme or all sorts of other techniques we'll learn later, but really all that we want to point out now is that we're making a change to our local development and we're saving this. So now we're in a scenario where our local site looks different than our staging and definitely different than our production. So we need to begin the process of exporting out from our local development using the plugin and pushing up to staging. To do that, let's come into our all-in-one database export plugin. Remember that we need to change the text. So in this case, when we're going from our local development up to staging, we need to do the process a little bit differently. Before we put in find the URL for staging and change it to local, now we need to say change it from local to staging. Okay, so again, this step is really important. Different tools will handle it differently, but this is how we are handling it with this plugin. Now we could go ahead and export it to a file. And once that's complete, we'll go ahead and download it locally, close out of there, and then come into our staging environment. So we'll come into staging and repeat the opposite process of coming down into our plugin, and instead of clicking on export, clicking on import, because remember, we're going from our local development into our staging. And this might seem a little scary. Worst case scenario, something goes wrong here, you may either have to back up your site or delete staging. So hopefully, since you already have a copy of it locally, you'll be fine. But just remember that this is going to wipe everything out when we go through this process, which is what we want to do. But like I said, it might feel a little risky until you really get comfortable with the whole process. So we'll let this upload and go through the process of getting the files ready. And then once it is complete, you'll see any notices or warnings telling you that it's going to override the process. And in this case, since in local development it had PHP 5, that should be changed to PHP 7. Otherwise, you shouldn't see this issue, but that may cause it to fail. Hopefully, we're going to be okay in this case, but a good note to make sure that in local or in desktop server, you make sure that you have the latest version of PHP to match your server setup. But let's go ahead and proceed. And we'll see that it goes through the process of updating our files and our databases, and then asks us to do the same process of going to permalink settings and clicking save changes there. So now that we've done that, let's come and check out our site. Okay, we're doing all right. We've got our staging environment matching our local environment that has the white background, just like we set up. And now we could look at our final process, which is getting this to production. Now, I will point out, if you've just been playing around doing this on a live production site that you don't want to push changes to, hold on a second, and you may want to pick up a second site just for demo or playing around or learning purposes. Is probably worth it. But let me show you what this process involves here. So what we're going to do here is actually come into our staging site, which is how this is going to allow us to push up to production. And if we come into our staging page in our staging environment, so again, we're back in our staging environment /staging/this, and we have a deployment option here that says deploy from staging to production. So this is going to take from our staging site here and automatically take care of all of the processes that we just went through to get it locally to staging and do that for us, pushing it to production. Now here's the options here that I mentioned you might see, and in our settings for our plugin, we could actually do this as well. You could just deploy the files, which would be the themes and the plugins and all of that. You could deploy the files and database, which is what we want to do because that'll do all of the changes. And the change that we just made in the customizer is actually saved in the database because it is a settings. And if you remember, settings are saved in the database. So likewise, we could also just deploy the database only, which would push those changes, but maybe not anything made to the files. So actually, technically, in this case, we could possibly get by with just deploying the database change, but what I really want to point out is the process that is most common of deploying files and database. Now, I'll say that this is most common with one caveat. Let's imagine that our live site was actually very user-driven. So we had a portfolio section and people were constantly adding their portfolio pieces. And in the 2 days it took us to pull things down into development, make our changes, and then get them up to staging, we had 100 new portfolios. Now we're in a bit of a situation. If we pull from staging back, or if we pull from production back down into staging, we would lose our changes and we couldn't pull all the way down into development because then we'd lose the changes we made there. But at some point there may be a difference in content that you don't want to override. So if you have content on your live site that has been added since you began working on things that cannot be done, you do not want to deploy the database or files and database together. Now, this isn't super common because not all sites work this way. However, it is something you do need to know about. If that was the case, what you would need to do is deploy files only. However, because as we said, the changes we made were to the settings, which are stored in the database, and we can't upload the database, in order to implement these specific changes, we would actually have to go to the live site and implement those changes there directly. Now, I know this may seem a little bit confusing, but really what I'm talking about is a fringe case. And usually when you pull something down from production into staging and down into development, and then you get ready to deploy, you should be able to deploy everything at once or just get your files there and maybe do a little manual entry. However, in this case, we get to deploy the files and database together. And when we do that, we get a very helpful reminder, which is saying, hey, are you sure you want to override everything in production? And in this case, we do. So we'll hit Let's Deploy. And then once that's done, we'll see a notification telling us that everything has been successfully deployed. Now comes the part where we finally test it and we go to our production site, refresh it, and see that our changes have been made. So at this point, we have gone from our local development, which we learned how to pull down into in the last lesson. We made some changes here that we pushed up to staging, and then we deployed them from staging to our live environment with the click of a button. Now, as mentioned, this won't work for all use cases, so as you go through this course, I suggest you to have a live production site that you could use for testing how you would push different theme changes or plugin changes or site content changes up to production and work with that changing workflow. If you get employment in companies that work with large sites that have content constantly updated, you may see different or more complex staging and local development workflows than what we've outlined here, but what we've covered here really is the basics and should be a practice that you implement as a standard. So once again, at this point, we have looked at how to go from local using a plugin up to staging, and from staging using your hosting provider straight into production. Now, as I've mentioned, you could go about doing this different ways. You could potentially set up your own subdomain staging site manually and use a plugin to override everything, but it is nice to let your hosting provider take care of some of that work for you, especially if it's something that they're offering for you out of the box. However, at this point, you should have a solid introduction to staging with WordPress, and I encourage you to practice all of this workflow a few times, find out what it's like to make changes at different points, or maybe you even want to try out different staging environments and options and different plugins for pulling and pushing to production. All in all, this is a great thing to practice along with setting up your local development before we proceed into the next section where we'll get into actually beginning to code with some PHP.